previous video we covered scope and scope inheritance, and in this video we are going to cover root scope and how it really affects the scope inheritance. So let us check what exactly is root scope. Imagine I have a module and a controller defined in this fashion. So which means I have a module with the name sample and I have two controllers where each of those named like EMP and EMP details respectively. And imagine I have the view in this manner. So which means this view currently is having ngapp defined at body and the two controllers which are really attached to respective div elements. So the first div is having a direct relation with ng controller EMP, and the second div is having the controller EMP details to be working with. And I just wanted to point out this particular div, or say this controller EMP details, will be actually nested as part of EMP. So we already knew this, like whenever AngularJS tries to execute this part, it actually creates a module, and afterwards it actually creates two definitions of the controllers, like each of the controllers named after EMP and EMP details respectively. Now coming to this whole body. So let us not consider really about the body here. What we really need to consider is ngapp sample. What I'm saying is our Angular application is currently attached to this particular element called body. Your ngapp could be attached to any element, but in this case I'm just using body. So whenever a particular element is attached to ngapp, which means the directive AngularJS app, that says that our particular AngularJS application starts at that particular element. So whenever we say my AngularJS application starts at this element, it is going to create a new scope on the spot. So whenever we say scope here, the first point we should understand, the scope which makes itself available at ngapp level is nothing but the root scope. So this scope is automatically created behind the scenes. You may be using it or you may not be. However, that particular root scope is automatically created the moment you define ngapp. And as that is a scope, it will be actually sitting at the DOM level, and currently it is attached to the body element. So whenever I say root scope, you can see at this moment that particular root scope is currently attached to body, and all the members whatever you are going to define as part of the root scope is available throughout this particular element, including all of its children and nested children. Okay. After the body, we have another element called div, and as I mentioned earlier, this particular div is currently associated with the controller called EMP, and you can see this is the controller currently it is getting attached with. The moment again AngularJS finds ng controller, it knows that it has to create another scope, and in this case I'm going to call that one as EMP scope, as because this scope is really tied up with that particular controller called EMP. And you can see this particular scope is currently nested inside the root scope. This is very important, as because this ng controller currently is nested inside the ngapp. The scope of this particular controller is also nested inside the root scope. Let us check another one. Now you have another div where that particular div related ng controller is linked to EMP details, and now you can see we have the controller EMP details being referred here. And as you know, AngularJS, the moment it finds ng controller, again it tries to create a scope, and in this case I am going to call that one as EMP details scope, as because that scope is really in relation with controller EMP details, and I'm just going to call EMP details scope. You can see here this particular EMP details scope is actually nested inside EMP, as because this ng controller is nested inside another ng controller, and that is the reason the scope created as part of this element, even though it is sitting at the DOM and attached to this div, it is still nested inside the previous scope, that is EMP scope, and the EMP scope is further nested inside the root scope. So in this case, you are actually referring the EMP scope as part of this controller, and you are referring EMP details scope as part of this controller, but you are not referring root scope anywhere here. So let us see, I would like to how I can use RootScope as part of my application. Till now we have been not using it, but instead the RootScope will always be created no matter what, whether I use it or not. So imagine I'm actually changing my particular first statement from simple Angular.module to something different. So in this case, it is pretty similar to what we have earlier. We have variable sample, which is nothing but the instance of the module what we are going to create. And you can see I'm saying like a module with the sample name needs to be created, and once that particular module is created, I would like to have this particular function to be executed just like the controller. However, we have something called .run here. So .run is a special method which will be executed once a module has been created. You can have multiple runs, so which means I can say .run and have the function, .run have another function, .run have another function. So in that way you can have multiple .runs and all of those will be executed the way they are supposed to be. But the most important thing is that the run will be executed once a module has been created. And in this case, you can see I am referring $RootScope, just like you were practicing $scope earlier attached to the controller. You need to understand we are following the same syntax here, and all I am going to say is instead of $scope I am saying $RootScope, which is a reserved word as part of AngularJS. So once I say $RootScope here, you are referring the same variable here with this variable name. This could be any name. It could be just called as A or B. But just for our understanding and readability, we are using the same $RootScope name here also. So if you are not following why we are actually using two different two names for $RootScope here and also here, $scope here and also here, probably you should watch my previous videos. Okay, so now that we know that particular module is currently having a run method which is currently using $RootScope, now is our part where I can say I would like to add a member called tax%, which is just a property. So this particular member property will be added to $RootScope with a value as 30. And the moment this particular part gets executed by AngularJS, you can see the RootScope. Inside the RootScope, I am going to have a member called tax% and a value called 30, which will be assigned to that particular member. So this member gets automatically made available to any of its children, including EMP and EMP details. So but for now I am saying like this particular tax% 30 is going to be made available to EMP scope. And let us see how EMP scope is going to be executed. Now coming to EMP scope. So as we know, once the scope has been created, the controller instance and controller gets instantiated, gets merged to the scope, and this function gets executed. And as part of this function, I'm saying like $scope.name equal to jag. So which means a new property or a new member for the scope of EMP will be created and a value will be assigned to that. And now you can see I have name and jag. So the most important thing, the tax% 30 will be automatically made available to this EMP scope. So that is pretty important. So even though this particular scope doesn't know anything about tax% here, but as this particular scope is actually getting inherited from the root scope, you can see that this particular member or all the members which have been defined as part of root scope will be automatically made available to the nested scope. So in this case, EMP scope will have name and also tax%. So let us see how the third one is going to be executed. So which is our EMP details. And you can see in this EMP details, this is nothing but this guy. I am actually adding two more members like salary and department number, and this scope refers to the scope related to EMP details. And you can see as part of EMP details I have these two. So theoretically now it is not just these two members what will be available as part of EMP details. This one is actually inheriting from this and this one inheriting from this. So the first thing is that the name will be made available to this one. So which means now EMP details scope will have name, salary and department number. And that's not the end of the story. We are going to have even the tax% also to be made available. So as long as your particular scope is inheriting from its parent, all the members of the previous parent will always be made available to any of its child regardless of its nesting level. So in this case, now EMP details will have tax percent, name, salary and department number. So this scope will have 4 members technically. So even though you are creating 2, yes, because this particular controller or the scope is inside is inside another controller scope, and that one is available inside another, all of those particular members will be added finally to the same scope of that particular nested scope. So this is pretty much about root scope. So the only point I would like to make here is that whether or not you work with root scope, the moment you define ng app as part of your application, a new scope gets created, and that is the scope you are going to call it as root scope, and it can have its own members if necessary. And if you define any members, those members will be automatically made available to any of the children's or child scopes, including the nested scopes. So let us jump to the next slide. So how do we modify, or what happens if we modify the root scope variable? So let us check this one. Imagine I have a root scope, and that particular root scope is currently having a member called tax percent, which is having a value 30. And as I mentioned, if anything is available as part of root scope, that will be made available to the child scope first, and in this case the child is having its own thing called name jag, and on top of it something has been inherited, and the child scope will also have access to tax percent. And again, as explained in my previous slide, if there is one more scope inside another scope, it will be inheriting all the 3. So which means it will have name, it will have tax percent and its own members as well. So we already understood this part. So what is so special about this slide? Imagine I am having 2 more scopes. So which means this particular root scope is having actually 3 scopes adjacent to each other, which means there is no relation between this scope and this, and there is no relation between this and this. However, these two have some relation, that is parent and child, but these are all siblings, so these do not have a direct relation. However, these particular scopes are actually part of the root scopes. So if such is the case, then again we should understand that the same root scope as being used or being part, those child scopes which are being made available as part of the root scope will always have the members to be carried forward from the root scope. You can see the same tax percent defined at the root scope level will be made available to all the children. And furthermore, imagine I have 2 more nested scopes as part of those particular scopes. So you can see this scope is having only one nested scope or child scope. But in this case I have 2 children, and in this case I have 2 children. As I mentioned, root scope means those particular members are made available to all the children and even the nested children as well. So now you can see all of those particular scopes, regardless of whether they are nested or not, as long as they are available as part of the root scope, all of those will have the same member to be automatically made available. Now let us consider one of the child scopes has actually modified the value of 30 to 40 for the root scope. So which means this particular tax percent, as part of this child scope, I modified the value as 40. Once you modify the value of a particular root scope member, that will be immediately affected everywhere. So that is important. Now you can see the moment you modified 40, it has modified 40 everywhere. So it is not really modifying. Whenever you are modifying any value here, actually you are modifying a value here. So as the same particular variable or the member is being accessible everywhere, indirectly the same value is being made available to every location. So it is not copying, you are referring to the same variable in every instance. If you modify the value, you are actually modifying the value available at the root scope. So once the main value gets modified, all the referred variables will be automatically having the latest values or the referred values or the current values. So this is pretty important. So if you have a member at the root scope and if you change the value of that particular member, it will be immediately reflected across all the scopes and all the child scopes wherever necessary. Okay, so this is what happens whenever you modify anything as part of root scope. And point to be taken, if you'd like to share any kind of values across the scopes, you have to use controllers or factories or services for that purpose, and make sure that you are not really using root scope exclusively to share the values across all the scopes. It is a bad practice and you should really keep away from such kind of practices. So it is available as some part of convenience, like it is available for our comfort zone, available as part of convenience, but it is not really a good practice to have the root scope to be always be used only for sharing the value or sharing the data. That is pretty important, and make sure that RootScope is always going to be your last choice of sharing the data if nothing else really works. Okay, so the next thing is how to access root scopes as part of your controller. So in my previous slide, you might have seen like how to provide the values as part of the root scope inside the module definition. So which means once the module gets executed, we know that .run gets executed once the module gets instantiated, and after that we can have our own controllers. But we haven't seen on how a controller can really access a root scope, variable or a member. So we are pretty much familiar with this kind of syntax. So which means I have a controller which will have a controller name and a scope, and you are going to refer the same scope as part of this variable, and you can use all of those according to your necessity. And imagine there is a value called 30 in this case, and this 30 in this case is nothing but tax percent. Let us consider. So this particular tax percent, we know that it is available as part of root scope. And if this particular value is already made available as part of root scope, how do I use that particular member as part of my controller? So which means I should be able to access the root scope right inside this controller. And for that purpose, you can slightly change your controller definition in this fashion. The first thing, EMP paycheck as usual, and next the scope as usual. However, immediately after the scope, I am saying that I would also like to have access to $root scope, and that is what I am going to use. So if it is scope, you are going to use scope and scope and scope and scope and scope. However, if it is root scope, you can see first of all, along with scope, you are saying that you are also going to use root scope as part of your controller, and the same referred variable of this particular root scope is this one. So in this case, this scope matches this root scope matches this, and once I have root scope here, now you have the luxury of accessing any kind of member as part of your particular controller just with the variable name called root scope, which is nothing but this variable. So this variable is nothing but the reference to this guy. So in that way, you can always access those particular members of the root scope as part of your controller, regardless of whether your controller is nested inside any number of levels. Okay, so let us have quick demonstration on the root scope. So imagine I have something like this, so which is from my previous example. So that is, once I refresh this guy, you can see I have employee details of JAG. This is nothing but the name. I have salary, I have taxes calculated, and I have net. So if you return back, you can see I have the controller, which is EMP, and having the name. So that name JAG is being automatically made available as part of my view here. And similarly, EMP details, which is having salary and department number, and you can see I'm actually using the same thing as part of EMP details. So this is important. I'm using EMP details here inside EMP. And after that, I'm having one more controller called EMP paycheck, which is being used inside EMP details. However, it is using $scope.salary. So this salary actually comes from its parent, which is nothing but EMP details. So how did I define this one as parent? You can see this EMP paycheck lives inside EMP details. So which means this is a child of this guy, and that is the reason the child can access all of the members of the parent. And in that way I have all of these interpretations. Now, as I mentioned, if I would like to have 30 to be actually used from my particular controller, and that particular 30 is actually defined as part of RootScope, how would I use it? So the first thing is that we need to ensure that that particular member is made available as part of the RootScope. For that purpose, as I explained in my presentation, I am going to use run definition here, and this particular run definition will have my RootScope defined. So that is $RootScope, and at the same time it will have a function which will have some variable which is catching the RootScope, and finally this is my particular definition to the function. So this is .run, which gets executed the moment module gets created, and as part of this particular function I'm going to use RootScope, and as part of this function I am going to say my RootScope will have a member called tax%, and I would like to provide a value as 30. And once that particular member is made available to the RootScope, it is automatically available to all of the controllers. So now I can directly use RootScope.tax% here, provided I actually add even the RootScope here. So in this case I would like to say I would like to have RootScope to be used as part of my controller, and I would like to refer that as RootScope as part of my controller, and all I had to do is that just copy this one right into this one. So the moment I have that, you can see actually I'm using this RootScope from this guy, which is nothing but this one. So Angular really knows that while creating the scope of this guy, it has to merge the root scope and the parent scope and the parent scope, and finally have all of those particular members to be made available as part of this scope. And once we have this, so let us go back here and just refresh it, and we should be still having the same value. Just for our testing, if I change this to 40 and save it and return back, and if I refresh it, we should be having the values to be automatically modified. Okay, so now that we have some understanding about the root scope on how to initialize those particular values as part of the module, you can also have those particular root scope related members to be accessed or added at the parent variable also. For example, imagine I just wanted to use a different syntax here. So let me copy this and get rid of .run here. And I just wanted to comment this one. So which means now this tax % is not available. However, I'm still trying to use tax % here, and let us see what's going on. So the moment I use this, you can see it could not understand what is tax %, and it is saying something like not a numeric value or not a number. Because you can see I got rid of root scope, and I'm trying to access root scope related tax %, for which no one really knows what exactly it is. So instead of actually having the tax % to be actually initialized during our module definition, you can also have those members to be added later, which means as part of the parent related controllers. So in this case, you can see EMP paycheck is a child of this guy, and this is a child of this guy. So I still have the opportunity to have certain members to be added to the root scope as part of the parent or the grandparent controllers. So for that purpose, in this case, for example, imagine I would like to add root scope related tax % right here after this. And certainly you can do that, provided you have the same kind of definition. So which means I have to say my function can use the scope and also root scope as part of its own controller definition. So now that I have scope and root scope to be used as part of the controller, I am saying that to the current scope, please add this member. However, to the root scope, I would like to add tax %. So it is not essential to really have that particular root scope to be always made available or initialized only through the module. You can also make it available right from any kind of controller. So I just save it and I refresh it, and now you can see this one still works. So now that we have some understanding on the scope inheritance and root scopes, the next video what I'm going to cover is mostly about data binding.